I used to think loneliness was about being alone. Growing up in Tacoma, I'd spent hours on my grandfather's fishing boat, just him and me, drifting through the Puget Sound while fog swallowed the shoreline. He never said much. Soren Callahan wasn't built for conversation, but I learned something from those quiet mornings that took me 26 years to understand. Loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of being known. My grandfather died when I was 14. Heart gave out while he was getting salmon in his garage. I found him there, knife still in his hand, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The doctor said it was quick, painless, but I've always wondered what he saw in those last seconds. What thoughts filled a mind that had spent 73 years keeping everything locked behind weather-beaten silence? I became a Navy sonar technician because I wanted to listen. Stupid reason, maybe. But there's something about sitting in a dark room, headphones clamped to your skull, parsing meaning from the noise of an entire ocean. It felt like the closest I'd ever get to understanding what my grandfather heard in all that quiet. For 6 years, I was good at it. Damn good. I could distinguish a whale's feeding call from its distress signal. I could tell you if a submarine was Russian or Chinese by the frequency of its propeller cavitation. The ocean spoke, and I translated. Then came the transfer orders. They didn't tell me where I was going, just coordinates. Just a submarine ride that lasted longer than any I'd taken before. Just a pressurized elevator that dropped so deep, my ears wouldn't stop popping for 3 days. Abyss Station. That's what we called it, though the official designation was some forgettable alphanumeric string. 17 of us, sealed inside a research facility bolted to the seafloor somewhere in the Pacific. Our mission briefing was a masterpiece of saying nothing. Monitor acoustic signatures, document findings, report anomalies through proper channels. What they didn't tell us was that there would be no proper channels, no surface contact, no resupply schedule we could count on. They didn't tell us about the signatures. I've been down here for I don't know how long anymore. The facility runs on artificial light cycles, but someone stopped maintaining the schedule weeks ago, maybe months. My watch died, and I stopped trusting the wall clocks after I noticed they've been showing different times in every room. What I'm about to write, I'm writing because I need someone to know. Not to believe me, just to know. The difference matters when you've spent this long being unheard. My name is Noah Callahan. I'm a sonar technician. I'm 32 years old, or I was when I came down here. And I've discovered something in the deep that I can't explain, can't escape, and can't stop listening to. It knows my name. The first time I noticed something wrong with the signatures, I was running a calibration test on Sonar Array 7. Routine stuff. You ping the water column, measure the return, adjust for temperature and salinity drift. I had done it 1,000 times on surface vessels. Down here, the process took longer. The pressure played tricks on sound waves, bent them in ways that required constant compensation. I was alone in the monitoring room, which we called the fishbowl, because of the curved glass partition that separated our workstations from the main corridor. Holmgren, the station's lead acoustic engineer, had designed a layout. Said it helped with morale, being able to see other people walking by. What it actually did was make you feel like an exhibit. The ping went out. I waited for the return. What came back wasn't an echo. It was a shape. On the sonar display, objects register as bright returns against the darker background noise. Rocks look like rocks. Fish look like small darting smears. Submarines look like the careful engineering they are. Smooth, symmetrical, designed to minimize acoustic signature. This shape looked like a person. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the gain. The figure was approximately 5 feet 10, arms at its sides, standing motionless roughly 200 meters from the station's eastern hall. Standing, in water that would crush an unprotected human body like a beer can under a boot heel. I pinged again. The shape remained. Then it moved. Not swimming, not drifting with current. It took a step, then another, walking along the sea floor, slow and unhurried, as if the crushing depth was nothing more than a gentle breeze. I pulled off my headphones and rubbed my eyes. Fatigue, I told myself. We'd all been pushing too hard, sleeping in shifts that never quite aligned with our body's needs. Holmgren had warned us about sensory artifacts, the mind's tendency to construct familiar forms from random noise. When I looked back at the screen, the shape was closer, 150 meters now. My fingers found the intercotton button without conscious thought. Holmgren, you need to see this. Static. Then his voice, groggy and irritated. Callahan, it's the middle of the night. There's no night down here. Get to the fishbowl. He arrived 12 minutes later, coffee in hand, wearing the same stained coveralls he'd had on for the past week. I'd watched the shape the entire time. It had stopped moving at 75 meters, just standing there, facing the station. What am I looking at? Holmgren asked, settling into the chair beside me. I pointed at the display. That. He studied the screen, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something I couldn't quite read. Run another ping. I did. The shape remained. But this time, when the sound wave hit it, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. It turned its head toward us. That's not possible, Holmgren said, setting down his coffee. Sonar doesn't work like that. You can't get that kind of resolution at this depth, not with our equipment. I know what sonar can and can't do. Then you know what you're seeing isn't real. I wanted to agree with him. I wanted to chalk it up to equipment malfunction, pressure-induced hallucination, anything with a rational explanation I could file away and forget. But then Holmgren reached past me to adjust the display settings, and the shape on the screen raised one arm, slowly, as if waving. We both sat there, watching, neither of us breathing. The arm lowered. The figure turned away and began walking again, moving along the perimeter of the station in a wide, patient arc. It's circling us, I said. Holmgren didn't respond. He was already reaching for the emergency line to Commander Vasquez. That was the first night. By morning, or what passed for morning, we'd counted 7 more shapes, all of them walking, all of them circling, none of them human, but all of them wearing human forms. Commander Vasquez didn't believe us. To be fair, by the time she arrived at the fishbowl, the shapes had retreated beyond our detection range. The screen showed nothing but the familiar scatter of deep-sea noise, bioluminescent organisms, thermal currents, the occasional confused fish that had wandered too far down. Vasquez stood behind our chairs for 15 minutes, arms crossed, watching nothing happen. Gentlemen, she said finally, I'm going to chalk this up to fatigue and pretend this conversation never occurred. I suggest you do the same. After she left, Holmgren wouldn't meet my eyes. He muttered something about getting some rack time and disappeared down the corridor, leaving me alone with the empty screen and the taste of something sour in my throat. I found Burke in the mess hall, nursing a cup of whatever brown liquid the food synthesizer insisted was coffee. Eirik Burke, everyone called him by his last name, was the closest thing I had to a friend on the station. We'd served together on the USS Virginia before this assignment, and he was one of the few people down here who didn't treat every interaction like a performance review. You look like hammered hell, he said as I sat down across from him. Vasquez thinks I'm losing it. Are you? I told him everything. The shapes, the walking, the wave. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I appreciated about him. When I finished, he took a long sip of his coffee and grimaced. You know what this sounds like, right? I know what it sounds like. I also know what I saw. Burke set down his cup and leaned forward. The pressure gets to people down here, Noah. Remember Kowalczyk? 3 months in, he was convinced the station was breathing. He said he could feel it expanding and contracting around him. They shipped him topside in a medical pod. This isn't that. How do you know? I didn't have an answer. That was the problem. Down here, cut off from sunlight and surface and any frame of reference that made sense, how could anyone know where reality ended and the mind's desperate fabrications began? That night, I returned to the fishbowl alone. Holmgren had requested a shift change, and I couldn't blame him. The monitoring room felt different in the quiet hours. Smaller somehow, the curved glass pressing in like the walls of a diving bell. I ran the standard sweep, not expecting anything. The shapes had been gone for 18 hours. They came back the moment I sat down. 11 of them now, clustered at the edge of detection range. I watched them on the screen, my pulse kicking up a notch. They weren't circling anymore. They were just standing there, facing the station. Facing me. I pinged them. They didn't move. Something occurred to me, an idea so strange I almost dismissed it. But I'd spent enough time down here to stop dismissing things. I thought about my grandfather, about finding him in the garage, the way his hand had gone slack around the knife. The grief I'd never properly processed, just buried under work and routine and the comfortable numbness of endless deployments. On the screen, the shapes began to drift apart, slowly, peacefully, like leaves scattering on still water. My breath caught. I thought about Vasquez, about her dismissal, the way she'd looked at me like I was a malfunction to be managed, the anger I'd swallowed, the professional mask I'd worn. The shapes on the screen snapped back together, their movements sharp and agitated. They began pacing in jagged lines, colliding with each other, clustering and separating in frantic surges. I forced myself to calm down. Deep breaths, count of the 10, thought about Tacoma, about fog on the water, about nothing at all. The shapes settled. They drifted back to their original positions, standing motionless once again. What the hell? I said to no one. I tested it again, and again. Every time the same results. When I felt calm, the signatures moved gently. When I felt anger or fear, they became erratic, almost violent. My emotional state was controlling them, or they were responding to it. I couldn't tell which possibility frightened me more. I called Burke first, then Holmgren, despite his reluctance. By the time they arrived, I had documented 17 separate tests. "This is insane," Burke said, watching the shapes drift peacefully as I focused on the memory of my grandfather's boat. "Insane," Holmgren agreed. "But it's also reproducible." Neither of them could explain it. Neither could I. But for the first time since I'd arrived at Abyss Station, I felt like I was finally listening to something that wanted to be heard. Word spread through the station like a contagion. Within 2 days, everyone knew about the signatures, everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to see for themselves. I became a reluctant tour guide, cycling crew members through the fishbowl in small groups, demonstrating the connection between my emotional state and the shapes on the screen. Some watched in silence, their faces tight with something between fascination and dread. Others asked questions I couldn't answer. What are they? Where do they come from? What do they want? A few laughed nervously and left quickly, as if proximity to the phenomenon might be infectious. Commander Vasquez observed from the corridor, never entering the room, never acknowledging what she was seeing. After the third demonstration, she issued a station-wide memo. All personnel were to focus on their assigned duties and refrain from unproductive speculation regarding acoustic anomalies. The memo did nothing. If anything, it made people more curious. The shift came gradually, then all at once. It started with UN, one of the life support technicians. She was a quiet woman, mid-40s, with graying hair she kept pulled back in a severe bun. I'd barely spoken to her in the months we'd been stationed together, but on the 4th day after the discovery, she appeared at the fishbowl entrance and asked if she could try. Try what? I asked. Communicating with them. I should have said no. Looking back, that was the moment when everything could have been different. But I was tired and confused and desperate for someone else to make sense of what I was experiencing. So I let her sit at the console. Yuen closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. On the screen, the signatures, that were 15 now, began to drift toward the station. Not aggressive, not erratic, just approaching, the way you might walk towards someone calling your name from across a crowded room. They're listening, Yuen said, her eyes still closed. They want to know why we're so afraid. How do you know that? She opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize. I can feel them, Callahan. Can't you? I couldn't. But within a week, a dozen other crew members claimed they could. Burke was the first to name what was happening. It's becoming a religion, he said. We were in his quarters, one of the few places on the station where you could have a private conversation. The walls were thin, but the constant hum of the environmental systems provided cover. They're treating those things like prophets. They're scared and looking for meaning. It's not religion, it's coping. What's the difference? I didn't have an answer. The believers, that's what the rest of us started calling them, began gathering near the fishbowl at all hours. They'd sit in the corridor, cross-legged, eyes closed as if meditating. Some brought offerings, small objects, photographs, handwritten notes. They placed them against the curved glass like prayers at a shrine. Vasquez ordered the items removed. They reappeared within hours. Yuen became their informal leader. She spoke about the signatures with a certainty that bordered on ecstatic, describing conversations none of us could hear, revelations none of us could verify. The shapes, she said, were travelers. They'd been waiting at this depth for longer than human memory. They didn't want to harm us. They wanted to understand us. Our emotions were a language they were learning to speak. And what happens when they're fluent? Burke asked during one of Yuen's impromptu sermons. Yuen smiled. Then, we won't be alone anymore. The non-believers clustered around Vasquez, though she never formally acknowledged the division. These were the pragmatists, the ones who trusted equipment readings over feelings and insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Oxygen levels, they suggested, contamination in the water recyclers, mass hysteria triggered by isolation and stress. Holmgren fell into this camp, despite what he'd witnessed that first night. The human brain is a pattern recognition engine, he told me over a meal neither of us was eating. It sees faces in clouds and hears voices in static. That's all this is, our minds projecting familiar shapes onto random acoustic noise. That doesn't explain why they respond to emotions. Confirmation bias. You expect them to react, so you interpret normal fluctuations as reactions. I've run the test, Holmgren. The correlation is statistically significant. He pushed his tray away. Statistics can prove anything if you massage the data enough. The tension between the two groups grew like mold in a sealed container, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. Believers and skeptics stopped eating together, stopped making eye contact in the corridors. The station that had felt merely isolated now felt divided, two camps sharing the same failing air. I tried to stay neutral, which meant both sides distrusted me. The signatures continued to multiply. 20, 25, 30. They no longer just circled or stood watching. They gathered in clusters, broke apart, reformed in new configurations. Sometimes they seemed to communicate with each other, their movements synchronized in ways that reminded me of birds flocking or fish schooling. Complex behavior, social behavior. Burke pulled me aside after one particularly intense demonstration, when Yuen had wept openly and claimed the signatures had shown her the face of her dead mother. "We need to talk to Vasquez," he said, formally, on the record. "This is getting out of hand." "She won't listen." "Then we make her listen. We're naval personnel, Noah. We have protocols for psychological deterioration. If we document what's happening, get statements from multiple witnesses, and say what? That our crew is splitting into factions of a ghost on a sonar screen?" Burke grabbed my arm, his grip tighter than I expected. "That's exactly what we say, because that's exactly what's happening, and if we don't do something, someone's going to get hurt." He was right, of course. I knew he was right. But that night, alone in the fishbowl, I watched the signatures drift and pulse on the screen, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. A sense of connection, of being perceived, of mattering to something, even if that something defied explanation. My grandfather had spent his whole life surrounded by water, listening to its silences. Maybe he'd heard something too, something he'd never found the words to share. I reached out and touched the screen. The signatures responded, clustering where my fingers pressed against the glass, the movements gentle, almost affectionate. "What are you?" I asked. They didn't answer, but they stayed close, and for a moment, the crushing loneliness of the BIS station felt almost bearable. I should have listened to Burke. I should have gone to Vasquez, demanded answers, insisted on evacuation protocols. Instead, I sat there until the artificial lights dimmed for night cycle, watching the shapes that had learned to feel what I felt, wondering if understanding them was worth losing myself. Okonkwo was the first to die. I didn't know him well. He worked in the lower engineering decks, maintaining the thermal exchange systems that kept our air breathable. A tall man, soft-spoken, with a gap between his front teeth that made his rare smiles memorable. We played cards once during a mandatory recreation period. He'd won every hand without gloating about it. They found him in Airlock 3 at 0600, already cold. He'd cycled himself out into the crushing dark without a suit, without warning, without leaving a note. The pressure would have killed him before the cold did. A small mercy, if you could call it that. What he'd left behind was worse than any note. On the wall of the airlock antechamber, written in what the medical officer later confirmed was Okonkwo's own blood, were 7 words. "They showed me the way home." Vasquez locked down the station within the hour. All airlocks required dual authorization. All personnel were to travel in pairs. All access to the fishbowl was restricted to essential monitoring only. The believers saw it as martyrdom. UN held a vigil outside the sealed airlock, leading prayers for Okonkwo's transition. She spoke about liberation, about shedding the prison of flesh to join the travelers in whatever realm they occupied. Her words drew nods from the gathered faithful, tears from some, fervent agreement from others. "He's not liberated," Burke said, pulling me away from the crowd. "He's dead. There's a difference." "I know that." "Do you? Because you've been spending a lot of time in that room, Noah, watching those things, talking to them." "I don't talk to them." Burke's expression told me he didn't believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself. The second death came 4 days later. Petty Officer Lund, a Norwegian woman who ran the communications array, not that we had anyone to communicate with. She'd been one of the skeptics, loud in her dismissal of the signatures as equipment malfunction. But somewhere in those 4 days, something had changed. Her bunkmate reported that Lund had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent hours staring at walls and muttering in her native tongue. She walked into the reactor cooling pool during the night cycle. The radiation killed her before anyone knew she was missing. On her bunk, they found a journal filled with drawings. Page after page of humanoid shapes, standing in rows, their arms raised as if in welcome. The last entry read, "They venter på mig." They're waiting for me. Vasquez called an emergency assembly in the mess hall. 17 people gathered, all that remained of our original crew. She stood at the front of the room, her uniform immaculate despite everything, her voice steady despite the exhaustion carved into her face. "We have a psychological crisis," she said. "2 deaths in less than a week, both self-inflicted, both connected to the acoustic phenomena some of you have been obsessing over. Effective immediately, the following protocols are in effect." She read from a tablet. Food rationing, to extend supplies until rescue could be arranged. Restricted access to all sensitive areas. Mandatory check-ins every 4 hours. Anyone displaying signs of psychological distress would be confined to quarters for observation. "In the fishbowl?" someone asked. I didn't see who. "The monitoring room is off limits to all personnel except myself and Chief Holmgren. Anyone caught attempting to access the sonar systems will be treated as a saboteur and confined accordingly." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Yuen stood, her face flushed. "You can't cut us off from them. They're trying to help us. Sit down, Yuen. They showed Okonkwo the truth. They showed Lund. They're offering us something none of us have ever had. A connection to something greater than this miserable steel coffin. I said, sit down." 2 of Vasquez's loyalists moved toward Yuen. She didn't resist as they forced her back into a chair, but her eyes never left the commander. Something had changed in that gaze. The ecstatic certainty had hardened into something colder, something patient. After the assembly, Burke found me in the corridor outside my quarters. "We need to get out of here," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "I don't mean the station, I mean the situation. Vasquez is cracking down, the believers are getting more extreme, and you're stuck in the middle looking like you don't know which side you're on." "I don't know which side I'm on." "That's the problem, Noah. You need to pick. Because when this falls apart, and it's going to fall apart, the people in the middle are the ones who get crushed." I wanted to argue, but he was right. The station had become a pressure cooker with the heat turned up and the safety valve welded shut. Vasquez controlled the food, the airlocks, the communications equipment, but she couldn't control what people believed. And belief, I was learning, was more dangerous than any external threat. That night, I dreamed of my grandfather. We were on his boat again, drifting through fog so thick I couldn't see the water. He was speaking, but no sound came out, just his lips moving, shaping words I couldn't understand. When I woke, my pillow was wet with tears I didn't remember shedding. The 3rd death was different. Reyes, one of the younger technicians, didn't kill himself. He tried to kill Vasquez. It happened in the mess hall during the morning meal distribution. Reyes had been quiet for days, withdrawn, skipping his mandatory check-ins. When Vasquez turned her back to collect her ration, he lunged with a sharpened piece of metal, part of a ventilation grate we later determined, and would have buried it in her neck if Holmgren hadn't tackled him first. In the struggle, Reyes kept screaming the same phrase over and over. "She's blocking the signal. She's blocking the signal. They can't reach us because of her." They confined him to the medical bay, strapped to a bed, sedated into silence. But the damage was done. The believers now had a cause beyond worship. They had an enemy. And Vasquez, already paranoid, retreated further into authoritarian control. She started locking doors between sections, creating choke points that required her personal authorization to pass. Food distribution became a daily ritual of suspicion, with loyalists checking names against lists, confiscating anything that might be used as a weapon. The station that had felt like a prison now felt like a cage within a cage. I tried to access the fishbowl twice. Both times I was turned away by armed guards, crew members I'd shared meals with, played cards with, now watching me with the flat eyes of people following orders they didn't question. The signatures I knew were still out there, still circling, still waiting. Burke came to my quarters on the 7th night after Okonkwo's death. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, a tremor in his hands he couldn't quite control. "They're planning something," he said. "The Believers. Ewan's been holding secret meetings in the lower decks. I don't know what they're saying, but people are disappearing from the Loyalist side. Not dying, switching. Every day there are fewer of us and more of them. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to help me get a message to the surface. There has to be an emergency beacon, something Vasquez doesn't control. If we can reach someone, anyone, maybe they can get us out before this place turns into a tomb." I looked at my friend, at the fear he was trying so hard to hide behind urgency and planning. I thought about the signatures on the screen, their gentle movements when I was calm, the violent surges when I was afraid. "Okay," I said. "I'll help you." But even as I said the words, I felt something twist in my chest. A doubt. A whisper. Maybe UN was right. Maybe there was something out there offering freedom from all of this. The fear, the division, the crushing weight of being trapped with people who were slowly losing their minds. Maybe Okonkwo and Lund hadn't been victims. Maybe they'd been the lucky ones. The coup happened on what I think was the 12th night. I say think because by then, time had become meaningless. The artificial light cycles had stopped functioning properly. Someone had sabotaged the environmental controls, plunging sections of the station into permanent twilight. We navigated by flashlight, by memory, by the occasional emergency strip that still glowed a sickly amber along the floor. Burke and I were in the lower decks when we heard the screaming. Not the distant, muffled kind that had become background noise over the past week. This was close, wet, punctuated by sounds I'd only heard once before, during a training exercise that simulated combat injuries, the sound of violence being done to human bodies. We ran toward the noise, then stopped ourselves. Running towards screams in a station full of people who'd lost their grip on sanity was a good way to join the dead. "Access ladder," Burke said, pointing to a maintenance shaft. "We can get to the observation deck, see what's happening without." Another scream, cut short. We climbed. The observation deck wrapped around the station's central hub, offering a view into the main corridor through reinforced windows. What I saw through that glass ended whatever hope I'd been holding on to. Vasquez was on the floor, still alive, but not for long. UN stood over her, holding something that caught the dim light, a surgical blade from the medical bay. The commander's loyalists were scattered around her, some motionless, some still twitching. I counted 7 bodies, maybe 8. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. The Believers surrounded the scene like congregants at an altar. Their faces held no rage, no triumph, just that terrible, patient certainty I'd seen growing in UN's eyes since the lockdown began. "The signal is clear now," UN said, loud enough for us to hear through the glass. "Nothing stands between us and them. Nothing stands between us and home." She knelt beside Vasquez and leaned close, speaking words I couldn't make out. Then she drew the blade across the commander's throat with the care of someone performing a sacrament. Burke grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the window. We descended the ladder in silence, our breathing too loud in the narrow shaft, and didn't stop until we'd reached the abandoned server room 3 levels down. "We're dead," Burke said. He wasn't panicking. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except arithmetic. 17 people on this station. 8 just died up there, maybe more. That leaves 9, and most of them are with UN. It's over, Noah. The emergency beacon is in the communications bay, which is on the main level, which is now controlled by people who just butchered our commander. He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. We're trapped at the bottom of the ocean with a cult that thinks dying is a promotion. I should have been terrified. Part of me was. But another part, the part that had been growing since I first saw those shapes on the sonar screen, felt something else. Curiosity. A need to understand. The fishbowl, I said. They'll go there next. It's the center of everything for them. So I need to see what they see. I need to know what's on that screen. Burke stared at me. You've lost your mind. Maybe. But I spent months watching those signatures, Burke. I know them better than anyone. If there's an answer, if there's any way to stop this, it's in that room. He didn't argue. I think he was too tired to argue, too beaten down by the weight of everything that had happened. We made our way through the maintenance corridors, avoiding the main passages, until we reached the fishbowl from a service entrance that Ewan's people hadn't thought to guard. The room was empty when we entered. The sonar display was active, casting a pale green glow across the curved glass walls. What I saw on the screen stopped me cold. The signatures had changed. They weren't circling anymore, weren't standing in loose clusters at the edge of detection range. They were lined up in rows, dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, and they were climbing, not walking, climbing, moving up the exterior of the station, their humanoid shapes scaling the hall like insects crawling up a wall. Some had already reached the upper levels, others were still emerging from the darkness below, joining the procession with movements that looked almost eager. "What the hell?" Burke breathed. I adjusted the display, zooming in on the nearest signature. The resolution was grainy, but I could make out details I'd never noticed before. Height, build, the specific way it held its arms. Something cold settled into my stomach. "I know that shape," I said. "What?" "That one. Third from the left, near the airlock section." I pointed at the screen. "That's Okonkwo. The height, the proportions. That's exactly how he stood. I remember from the card game. He always kept his shoulders hunched, like he was trying to take up less space." Burke moved closer to the display. "Noah, that's..." And there. I pointed to another signature, smaller, with a distinctive way of tilting its head. "That's Lund. She did that when she was thinking, that little head tilt. I saw her do it 100 times in the corridors." The cold in my stomach spread outward, into my chest, my limbs. I scrolled through the display, examining each signature with growing horror. Every single one corresponded to someone dead, not just Okonkwo and Lund. There were others, shapes I didn't recognize from my time on the station, older deaths, people who had been here before me, whose names I'd never learned, whose faces I'd never seen. "The original crew," I said. "Burke, there was a crew here before us. There had to be. These signatures, they've been down here for months, maybe longer, since before I arrived." "That's not possible. We were the first deployment." "We were told we were the first deployment, but look at this." I pulled up the signature count, the data logs I've been keeping since the beginning. 17 signatures on day 1, the exact number of our crew. But they weren't new, Burke. They were already here, waiting. Burke backed away from the display. "What are you saying?" I didn't answer. I was watching the signatures climb, watching them converge on the upper levels where Ewan and her followers were gathered, with the bodies of the Loyalists still cooled on the floor. And I was counting. 53 signatures now, 17 original crew, 8 dead Loyalists. And the rest were ghosts from a deployment that had never officially existed, climbing the walls of a station that had been lying to us since the day we arrived. The speakers crackled. Ewan's voice filled the room. They're here. They're finally here. Everyone come to the observation deck. It's time. It's time to go home. Burke grabbed my arm. We need to hide, now. But I couldn't move. On the screen, one of the signatures had separated from the rest. It was climbing faster than the others, moving with purpose toward the upper airlock, the one that led to the station's exterior roof platform. The shape was my height, my build. It moved the way I moved, with a slight favor I gave my left leg from an old training injury. It was climbing toward the roof, and somehow, I knew it was waiting for me. The station descended into chaos within minutes. Yuan's voice continued over the speakers, a loop of rapturous welcome that mixed with screams from somewhere in the upper decks. Burke pulled me toward the service corridor, but I resisted, my eyes locked on the sonar display. No, we have to move. Look at them. On the screen, the signatures had reached the station's midsection. They pressed against the hull from outside, their shapes clustering around airlocks, viewports, any point of potential entry. They weren't trying to breach, at least not yet. They were assembling, organizing, like soldiers preparing for an assault they knew they'd already won. A gunshot echoed from above, then another, then a burst of automatic fire that went on for far too long. Someone found the weapons locker, Burke said. We moved. The service corridors were cramped, designed for maintenance drones rather than full-grown adults. We crawled through conduits and squeezed past pipe junctions, navigating by the emergency lighting that still functioned in the lower sections. Every few seconds, sounds filtered down from above. Screaming, gunfire, once a long wail that cut off with terrible abruptness. Burke led us toward the reactor section, where he knew of a hardened shelter designed for radiation emergencies. If we can seal ourselves in, wait out whatever's happening. He stopped. A figure blocked the corridor ahead. It was Holmgren. He stood in the amber glow of the emergency strips, his coveralls dark with something wet, his hands empty but shaking. When he saw us, his face contorted. You, he said, pointing at me. You brought them here. Holmgren, we need to... I ran the data. His voice cracked. After Vasquez died, I ran the data. Every signature, every timestamp. They appeared when you arrived, Callahan, not before. When you stepped off that elevator, they woke up. That's not... What are you? He took a step toward me, his hands curling into fists. What the hell are you? Burke stepped between us. He's the same man he's always been. The same man who served with me for 3 years. Whatever's happening here isn't his fault. Then whose fault is it? Holmgren's eyes were wild, darting between us like he couldn't decide who to attack first. 17 of us came down here. Now 8 are dead and the rest are... He gestured upward, toward the sounds of gunfire and worship. The only variable that changed was him. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that correlation wasn't causation, that whatever connection existed between me and the signatures didn't make me responsible for any of this. But the words died in my throat, because part of me believed him. The signatures responded to my emotions. They'd been there since I arrived, and now one of them wore my shape, climbing toward a roof where something waited to be completed. "Move," Burke said, shoving Holmgren aside. The engineer stumbled but didn't fall, didn't pursue. He just stood there, watching us go, muttering calculations to himself like a man trying to solve an equation that had no solution. We made it another 50 meters before the believers found us. There were 4 of them, emerging from a junction we hadn't seen. They wore the faces of people I'd eaten meals with, shared jokes with, trusted with the small intimacies of confined living. Now those faces held nothing but fever-bright conviction. "The traveler," one of them said. I think it was Diaz from life support, but I couldn't be sure. "The one who called them." "We've been looking for you, Callahan." Yuen's voice from somewhere behind them. She stepped into view, the surgical blade still in her hand, still wet. "The others have gone to meet them. But you're special, aren't you? You're the key." "I don't know what you're talking about." "The shape on the roof." She smiled, and there was nothing human left in that expression. "It's been waiting since before you arrived. It's been wearing your face, learning your movements, practicing being you. And now it's time for you to become what you were always meant to be." "He's not one of them," Burke said. Yuen's smile didn't waver. "How would you know? How would any of us know? The signatures match the dead, but what if some of them match the living? What if Callahan died months ago and something else has been walking around in his body ever since?" The believers murmured agreement. I saw their hands tightening on improvised weapons, pipes, shards of metal, a fire extinguisher raised like a club. "He's not real," Diaz said. "He's the last imposter, the last thing pretending to be human." They rushed us. Burke fought. I saw him grapple with 2 of them, buying me seconds I didn't deserve. I heard him shout something, run maybe, or go. And then I was moving, sprinting down the corridor without looking back. The sounds of struggle faded behind me. I told myself Burke would be fine, that he was stronger than he looked, that I'd circle back and find him once I'd lost the pursuers. I told myself a lot of things. The access ladder to the upper airlock appeared on my right. I grabbed the rungs and climbed, my injured legs screaming with each step. Behind me, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Above me, the hatch to the roof platform waited, the shape on the sonar then climbing toward this exact spot. I didn't know what I'd find when I opened that hatch. I didn't know if I was running toward salvation or damnation, or something worse than either. But I knew I couldn't stop. Whatever waited on that roof had been waiting for me specifically, had been wearing my face, my movements, my entire existence like a costume it was preparing to fill. I had to see it. I had to know. The hatch was heavier than I expected. My arms burned as I pushed against it, the pressure seal fighting me with every inch. Below, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Footsteps on the ladder, voices echoing up the shaft, promising things I didn't want to hear. I shoved harder, felt the seal break, and tumbled out onto the roof platform as freezing wind slammed into my body. I'd forgotten there was weather. Months underground, breathing recycled air, staring at screens in windowless rooms. I'd forgotten that the world above still existed. Now it announced itself with brutal force. Rain driving sideways, waves visible in the distance as white-capped mountains of black water, and wind that tore at my clothes like it wanted to peel me apart. The station's roof was a flat expanse of metal grating, maybe 40 meters across, studded with communication arrays and sensor equipment. Emergency lights flickered along the perimeter, casting pools of red that the storm kept trying to swallow. Beyond the railing, there was nothing but ocean, miles of it in every direction. We were alone out here, more alone than I'd ever understood. and I wasn't the only one on the roof. The figure stood at the far edge, near the railing, perfectly still despite the wind that should have knocked it over. It faced away from me, looking out at the churning water, but I knew it was aware of my presence. I could feel it, the way you feel someone watching you from across a dark room. I walked toward it. The grating shook under my feet, slick with rain, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, the hatch banged open again. UN probably, or whoever remained of her congregation. I didn't look back. The figure didn't move as I approached. 10 meters. 5. Close enough now to see details. It was me. Not a rough approximation, not a shape that suggested familiarity. It was me. The exact curve of my shoulders, the specific way my hair stuck to my forehead when wet, the old scar on my left hand from a childhood accident with a fishing knife. Even the way it stood, weight slightly off the left leg, matched my posture perfectly. "What are you?" I asked. The wind tore my words away, but I knew it heard me. The figure turned. Its face was my face. Every feature, every line, every imperfection I'd spent 32 years learning to ignore. But the eyes were wrong. Not empty, not black, not any of the things you'd expect from a monster wearing human skin. They were just still. Like water that had stopped moving, like sound that had stopped carrying. It raised one hand and pointed at me, then at itself, then at the water below. I don't understand. Its mouth opened. What came out wasn't words. It was a frequency, a tone I recognized from countless hours in the fishbowl, the specific pitch the sonar used when it found something significant. The sound burrowed into my skull, resonated in my chest, and for one terrible moment I understood everything. The signatures weren't ghosts. They weren't travelers. They weren't anything external at all. They were us. Reflections. Echoes of our own minds, broadcast into the water by something buried beneath the station, bounced back as shapes we couldn't help but recognize. Every fear, every grief, every fragment of identity we'd carried down into the deep. The machine had taken it all and shown it back to us until we couldn't tell the difference between self and signal. We'd been haunting ourselves. The figure lowered its hand. Its expression, my expression, held something that might have been pity. Behind me, Ewan's voice cut through the storm. "The traveler returns. The circle closes." I turned. She stood by the hatch, flanked by the last of her followers. 3 of them, maybe 4, their faces ecstatic despite the rain streaming down their cheeks. They moved toward me with arms outstretched, ready to embrace or restrain, I couldn't tell which. "You have to listen," I shouted. "It's not real. None of it's real. There's something under the station, something that's been..." "He denies his own divinity," Ewan said, smiling. "Even now, at the moment of transcendence." They kept coming. I looked at the figure, at myself, still standing by the railing. It nodded once, then stepped over the edge and disappeared into the black water below. No splash I could hear over the storm. No disruption in the waves. Just there, and then gone. Ewan's hands closed on my arm, and I understood what the figure had been telling me. The only way out. The only way to silence the signal. To stop feeding the machine with my thoughts and fears and desperate need to be known. I wrenched free and ran for the railing. The water was so cold it stopped my heart. Or maybe my heart had already stopped. Had stopped months ago when I first descended into the deep, and everything since had been nothing but echo. The last thing I saw before the black swallowed me was the station above, shrinking into the storm, and the shapes still climbing its walls, pressing against every surface, wanting in. The sonar room went silent, and in the silence, everyone left inside finally heard what the machine had been saying all along. The recovery team reached Abyss Station 17 days after final contact was lost. They found the facility intact, power systems functional, life support operational, food stores sufficient through another 3 months of habitation. They found no survivors. The bodies were distributed throughout the station in configurations that suggested violence, self-harm, and what the psychiatric consultant termed ritualistic behavior. Several had died from blunt force trauma, others from exposure to vacuum via deliberate airlock cycling. 3 were discovered in the sonar monitoring room, seated in a circle, hands joined, with no apparent cause of death. Commander Vasquez's body was recovered from the main corridor with wounds consistent with a bladed weapon. Her personal effects included the sealed envelope containing the handwritten letter addressed to Naval Command. The contents have been classified, but relevant excerpts follow. I was ordered to maintain operational secrecy regarding the true nature of this installation. I followed those orders until it became clear that doing so would result in the deaths of everyone under my command. By the time I attempted to disclose the situation, it was too late. The crew believes they are monitoring natural acoustic phenomena. They do not know that Abyss Station was constructed directly above Project Leviathan, a prototype weapons system designed to weaponize emotional resonance. The device reads bioelectric signals through the station's hall. It amplifies and rebroadcasts them as acoustic patterns calibrated to stimulate specific neural pathways. In controlled tests, subjects reported heightened emotional states, vivid hallucinations, and eventual dissociative episodes. The project was suspended 18 months ago, following an incident that resulted in the deaths of the original research team. I was told the device had been deactivated. I was told it was safe. I was lied to. Technical analysis confirmed Commander Vasquez's account. Project Leviathan's primary array, a deep-sea acoustic emitter spanning 200 meters beneath the station's foundation, had been experiencing intermittent activation for approximately 7 months prior to the incident. The malfunction was traced to a degraded containment seal that allowed seawater to conduct power to systems that should have remained dormant. The device had been broadcasting continuously, feeding the crew's own psychological signatures back to them through the sonar systems. Every fear, every memory, every subconscious fragment had been captured, amplified, and returned as audio-visual phenomena indistinguishable from external contact. The signatures reported by station personnel were not ghosts, entities, or communications from unknown sources. They were mirrors. The crew had been perceiving their own minds, reflected and distorted, growing more elaborate as the device learned to refine its output. The shapes matched deceased personnel because grief and memory provided the strongest emotional signatures. The shapes responded to emotional states because they were generated by those same states. Abyss Station was not haunted by anything external. It was haunted by the 17 people trapped inside it, broadcasting themselves into the dark until they could no longer recognize their own reflections. Project Leviathan has been permanently decommissioned. All documentation has been destroyed except for this report, which will be archived in accordance with national security protocols. No families will be notified. No bodies will be returned. The official cause of death for all personnel will be listed as structural failure during routine operations. The ocean keeps its secrets. We intend to keep ours.